Are you still dreaming about going to Cuba next spring? Well, Devs 306 is still on. 3 units in the winter term, 221 January to April, and then 307 Cuban Culture and Society in Havana if travel is authorized. 3 units in the spring term. So, sign up if you're interested. All right.
Action.
This is quite the mushroom. What do you think? I'm going to cook it up here. I'm gonna cut the bottom off. See that? And then we're going to cut it up into pieces. Just like this. Because we're going to put it in the frying pan with some butter. And Sammy thinks he may get some. What do you think, Sam? What do you think? This is a lot of mushroom. This is called a puffball. And this time of year, we can find them usually out the edge of fields. All right, now I'm going to go over and put some butter in the frying pan. You didn't know this was going to be a cooking show this week, did you? All right, well, we're going to cut some of this out. Because we just want fresh butter. All right. Okay. Can you come a little closer, Maggie, with the camera? All right. Okay. Now you can turn it off. And let it get sort of brown. We want them to be nice and golden brown. Ah, looks good. Now, look at that. All right, now.
Oh, God, you gotta focus.
Sort of like a giant marshmallow, but not sweet and twice the flavor. All right. Here, Maggie. Here we are where we began at the very beginning of the course. I could sit here and be a talking head, or we could go for a walk in the woods. What would you like to do? It's a beautiful forest. It's fall. Colors are lovely. It's been raining, so things are wet. Let's just go for a walk. Lesson 5 begins a new module in this course, which we call Subjects and Analysis, and which over the next 6 lessons we're going to cover a variety of subjects that are pertinent to Indigenous theory. And by looking at those subjects, we're going to try to engage in some analysis of how they apply to Indigenous theory. The first one, Lesson 5, which is today, is Biology, Genetics, and Hardwired Behavior, in which we're going to look at evolutionary psychology as a means of understanding how our thinking, our brains work, our conception of how we perceive the world around us and how we convert that into behavior. Well, Indigenous theory depends upon evolutionary psychology in helping us understand the mechanisms, the actual physiological mechanisms that allow us to translate our environment into genetically learned behaviors, or at least domains that help us select in the here and now how we're going to behave and how to predict the consequences of our behavior. In this coming module, we're going to look at a number of things. We're also going to look at the software, or the way in which we use culture to modify our environments and modify the consequences of our behavior so that it works for us in the here and now. In Lesson 7, we're going to look at how we use sort of spirituality, dreams, how human beings have used psychedelics in order to reorganize modes of perception in order to reorient their place and their adaptability within natural environments. We're going to look at human population development, so we're going to look again at Turchin, and we're going to look at Solons again in terms of human population developments, and that process of succession, how one culture succeeds another, and how that ties into the immense diversity among human cultures. We're going to also look at an issue that seems to be pretty important to almost all of you, and that is hierarchy, egalitarianism, and we're going to look at how humans engage in acts of violence or altruism, and how those form some of the basis of Indigenous cultures. And then finally, again, we're going to look at that succession, or the way in which Indigenous society into modernity, and how modernity sometimes dissolves into Indigenous ways of living. So, which has to do with our ideas around re-indigenization. And so many of you have identified re-indigenization as perhaps a mode that we can learn from and adapt to. So that's where we're going with this next module in terms of subjects and analysis. Let me tell you about Lesson 5 today. The beginnings of evolutionary psychology probably begin with Jung, Carl Jung, and his ideas about a historical memory that is encoded within all human beings, a universal historical memory. And what he's getting at is that somehow in our psyche, in our way in which our personalities develop, there are meaningful images which we all share. And we can experience these in dreams or other types of visions, in daydreams, uh, or in fantasies. Sometimes we express them in religious mythology. What he's talking about in these images is they represent a domain of our cerebral mechanism, our cerebral uh, mechanics that allows for these images to manifest themselves, representing a base of ancestral knowledge. The readings for this week are helpful, I think, in getting us some grounding in the idea of evolutionary psychology. There are some axioms that Sally Walters in her article sets down. She writes, adaptations were designed by natural selection to solve specific fitness related problems in a physical, social, personal, or ecological environment of the Pleistocene. What she's saying is that people that lived at that particular time, primarily these were foragers. Now, this was a particular period of time in which humans spread out pretty well across the globe. Over the last really 150,000 years during the Wisconsin Ice Age, we had an immense migration of Homo sapiens, human beings. Dr. Walters uh, examines Jungian psychology fairly extensively in this article. She writes that Jung shares with modern evolutionary psychologists the assumption that thought and emotion in some cognitive areas are framed and organized by psychological adaptations when activated by some extent in the social and ecological environment. Taking some of these thoughts and applying them to the article by Borklin and Pellegrini can be extremely helpful. Borklin and Pellegrini begin basically as well with a definition of what um, evolutionary psychology is all about. They say that evolutionary psychologists attempt to describe contemporary human functioning in terms of evolved psychological mechanisms. What they say is that it is a hard wiring that we inherit, just the same way we inherit our digestive systems or our skeletal structures. We inherit these innate structures over a long period of time through a genetic memory. In order for hardwiring to evolve, it's required basically that a, uh, a consistency has to be maintained over a long period of time. That's why the Paleolithic period tends to be so looked at as the area in which most of our hardwiring around behavior and those psychological domains took place. In order to get to the heart of that, what Borklin and Pellegrini have done is they've said, well, let's look at childhood. Let's look at how these aspects of determinate behavior are reflected in the way in which children develop. And we can clearly see that child development is very much um, based on this kind of hardwiring because almost all children go through particular developmental milestones, from finding first nutrition from their mother's breast in the way that they do that, to learning language, to learning to play with others, actually managing risky types of play, and finally through creating personal attractiveness in order to attract mates. So all of these developmental milestones are almost universal they are universal within human beings. And so we can look at these behaviors and understand evolutionary behavior in a much more finite way than we can, say, looking at older human beings. I have enjoyed reading both of these articles. I've read them numerous times now because I've used them in each time that I've taught this course because I find them useful. However, I want to point out that there are really good reference pages at the end of both of these articles, which will give you access to, if you're willing to look them up, other articles and other writings about evolutionary psychology. And I think that's essential if you're interested in this part of Indigenous theory. I think this is a basic part of Indigenous theory, understanding our behavior, because behavior is something that's interpreted by others. It's something that demands reaction within a group. And Indigenous theory really depends upon that. I've said this before, is that many people can have indigenous skills. Many people can have skills to live out in the forest and can survive for a lifetime. But that does not guarantee group survival. And human survival is dependent upon group survival. For us to be able to pass on genetically our inherited knowledge through our genetic system requires generation upon generation of similar practices, similar responses over long, long periods of time. And that takes group cohesion, something that we have begun to study as well in this course on Indigenous theory. So, I hope you enjoy these articles. I'm looking forward to a lively discussion because evolutionary psychology touches us all. Whether it's the kind of archetypes that motivate our personal behavior or our group cohesion, and our archetypes that are the basis of our interactions with the environment and with the world around us, how we project ourselves, our persona. So all of this has to do with species, survival, and fitness. So let's have a lively discussion. There are no holds barred in our academic discussions. Whatever you feel is important, I really want you to express in the group discussions and react to one another, give each other support, but also delve into the ideas, challenge each other's ideas, challenge my ideas. Okay? So I'm looking forward to this week's